Would you be okay with a Muslim prime minister of UK?
Yeah, absolutely. Do I think we have a particular problem in the UK with radicalized Muslims? I'm not convinced by that. You're just, picking on people because of their Muslim faith.
If you were okay with somebody who's a Muslim to become a prime minister, then they come in and they say, hey, Sharia law, what are you going to do about it?
You can't tar the entire Muslim population with the brush of potential extremism in the same way that you get Christian extremists in America who've committed appalling atrocities.
You're comparing the two?
It's the same, isn't it?
It is.
Are we really suggesting that 1.4 billion Muslims are all potential extremists? Because I don't get that sense of the Muslims I know in London. I go to a lot of Muslim countries, felt completely safe.
Look, honestly, I did not wake up this morning thinking I'd be watching Piers Morgan of all people reduce Patrick Bet-David to a glitching Windows 98 startup screen. But somehow, that's exactly what happened. Piers didn't just push back on PBD's argument. He took it apart so casually, so cleanly, it felt like he was brushing dust off his sleeve. And the further this exchange goes, the more unhinged and genuinely funny it becomes. So make sure you stay all the way to the end, because I'm saving my full breakdown for last, and that's the part you really don't want to miss. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from. Drop your country, your city, your couch coordinates, whatever works. And as always, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next breakdown. Let's get into it.
So if you look at this number, this is estimated Muslim population in UK by percentage from 83 till today. I'm sure you've seen this. 500,000 in 83, 1%. And then it cracked 1 million in 97, 14 years later. And then 2 million, and then 4 million, and then 4.5. Some say 5 million today, 6-7% of the population. Do you think this growth, the way it's going right now, getting to 10, 20, 30%, do you think it is a good idea to keep allowing people to come in to combine the Islam way of thinking, what their ideas are, and coexist with the Western ideology?
Well, I think there are issues which are serious to be considered. For example, it's been reported there are as many as potentially 85 unofficial Sharia courts in the UK now, which are not operating under UK law. They're operating in their own law for their own communities. That clearly is not a good thing in a country like the UK. So we have a lot of Muslims who live in the UK. We've always been a very multicultural, very tolerant place. The vast majority of Muslims living in the UK have assimilated perfectly well and live perfectly peaceful and lives which contribute to society. And then you see the quite disturbing spectacle of protests, say, in London, during the Israel-Hamas war, where people are brazenly supporting Hamas in these protests. And, Hamas is a prescribed terror group in the United Kingdom. That should be not happening. The sweeping migration, much of it coming from countries that have been at war, whether it's Syria, Iraq, or wherever it may be. But you've had millions and millions and millions of people deposed from their homes or fleeing war-torn situations and sweeping across the continent of Europe and wanting a better life for their families, which I completely understand. But it has got unsustainable.
If you ask the Muslim Council of Britain, it'll say that 75% of Muslims in Britain have assimilated and see themselves as Brits.
Yeah.
I'm a Brit. I consider myself proud Brit as well, but 25% don't, depending on the numbers you look at. How would Winston Churchill today, would Winston Churchill be tolerant with the borders? Would he be like, yeah, it's okay, let him come in?
No.
Would he handle the threat? And think about how his wiring was. This is your world.
Yeah.
What do you think he would have done today?
No, I think he'd have been tough. I think he'd have been very...
In what way?
Well, I think he'd have been very protective of our borders in a way that was very protective against the threat of Nazism to our way of life.
What would Churchill have done? What do you think he would have done?
I think what would he have done?
Seriously, what do you think he would have done? Just think his profile.
I certainly think right now he would have put the clamps down on more people coming
would
in.
He have
except
sent,
in exceptional circumstances.
Would he have sent anybody back from the 7% that came here? How would he have treated some of the criminals? How would he have treated some of the some of the stuff that's going on?
So I would say he certainly wouldn't have just picked out the Muslim community. We have a lot of different religions, nationalities living in the UK. I don't think he would have singled out Muslims. I think what he would have taken a more pragmatic view and gone, we have too many people in this country now. There's too much pressure on our public services. Some people are going to have to leave. I don't know why they're not sort of tougher on the French. You've got to do a deal with the French on this. You've got to say, look, sorry, you're letting all these people get on these boats. Once they're at sea, there's hardly any way to stop them. And then once they wash up on our shore, they are legally allowed to remain as potential asylum seekers.
Would you be okay with a Muslim prime minister of UK?
Yeah.
You'd be okay. That wouldn't do anything.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's your concern isn't that at all?
No, not at all. No, listen, I don't want to radicalize Muslim running the country. I don't want to radicalize anything. running the country. There's a lot of radicalized elements of all religions, of all nationalities. Do I think we have a particular problem in the UK with radicalized Muslims? I'm not convinced by that. I think there are radicalized Muslims, and clearly the Muslim population is rising exponentially fast compared to other populations. So we are going to have to look at this and say, well, what do we do about this going forward in a way that you don't look like you're just picking on people because of their Muslim faith?
I respect the tolerance that you have of what could happen to Brit long term, because I think sometimes when you're in it and it's gradual, like the whole thing about you put a frog in a boiling water and you boil it slowly, and then boom, he's dead. It's too late, right? I think sometimes when people are in it, they're like, yeah, well, it's okay with this, it's okay with that, it's okay with this. I think UK is flirting with being tolerant, and it'd be interesting to see who would rise up and want to do something about it.
Well, look, I go to a lot of Muslim countries. I've been in Saudi Arabia. I've been in
To me,
Qatar.
the biggest thing is the extremists. It's not a...
No, exactly. Here's my point, though. But also, they have zero tolerance of people wanting to operate under their own laws when they go to those countries. For example, so the whole debate about Sharia law and so on, I can understand why a lot of Brits get exercised about that, because if I went to Saudi Arabia or Qatar or somewhere and decided I would ignore the country's laws and operate under my own laws while I was there, you wouldn't get away with it for very long.
So why would you be okay with that? Why would you be okay with that?
Well, I wouldn't.
No, but what I'm saying is, so if you were okay with somebody who's a Muslim to become a prime minister, and then say they're the noble one, right? And they're coming in, they actually love Britain, but it opens it up, and an extremist like, I'm going to get in, then they come in and they say, Sharia law, what are you going to do about it? Then what? Because you're making it a step ahead.
Yeah, but I don't think you can't tar the entire Muslim population with the brush of potential extremism in the same way that you get Christian extremists in America who've committed appalling atrocities. I don't assume that every Christian, I'm a Christian, I don't assume every Christian in America is a potential extremist. I just think it's there's got to be a more...
You're comparing the two?
No, I'm just saying extremism is extremism. Isn't it? Isn't it?
Is.
Well, it's the same, isn't it?
It is. No, I think extremism is extremism. To me, that's not the part of it. But when you look at the percentage of who is, like, for example, in America, do you remember the story about the Japanese when they went to the World Cup? What were they doing afterwards at the end of the game? They were cleaning up the arena. Everybody's like, what are they doing here? That's what we do in Japan. So would I want 1,000 Japanese neighbors? Yes. They are their own people. They raise kids. They go and work. They don't hate America. They don't get up there and, commit terrorist crime. You don't hear stories like that from them. They just go and do their part, right?
But I would argue this back. Right? So I went to the Qatar World Cup, for example, for a week. Felt completely safe. There was no hooliganism whatsoever.
But that's not the same as the extremists. These are two different...
No, I agree. But again, I think there's extremists everywhere attached to all different groups. And I would say that I like the way the Middle East has been opening up in the last decade. I think it's exciting, it's dynamic. I just interviewed Cristiano Ronaldo in Riyadh at his home there. One thing he said, it just feels really safe. And it feels like it's opening up in a way that's good for families and everything else. And I think that's great. I don't like the tinge of you're all potential extremists until you prove otherwise.
No, because
I think it's unfair to a whole... I mean, how many Muslims are there in the world? 1.4 billion? Are we really suggesting that 1.4 billion Muslims are all potential extremists? Because I don't get that sense of the Muslims I know in London. I walk down my high street in London. There are Muslims running all sorts of different businesses.
Okay.
And honestly, they're not extremists.
If we look at immigrants that come to America, what percentage of them are on SNAP the most? Have you seen this chart?
No.
Food stamps by ethnicity. 45.6% of immigrants from Afghanistan are on SNAP. 42.4% from Somalia. 35% from Iraq. So why are we inviting more from Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq?
I'd need to study this in more depth, but certainly the Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq, these are people, I imagine, predominantly who have fled war-torn countries. So they, by definition, when they come to America, are going to be impoverished.
Yeah,
right?
but when America was founded, it's about getting the best to come over here, right?
You fled your family
Iran. I lived there for 11 years.
From a war-torn place.
We did.
Right? So take Iraq, for example. When I was editor for the Daily Mirror in the UK, I opposed the Iraq war before, during, and after it. It cost me my job in the end.
Yeah.
After 10 years running the newspaper. But I think I was vindicated by what happened afterwards. That war was fought on a false pretext. Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. They never found them. So and also there was this kind of subliminal, we need to respond to 9/11. We can take out Saddam. I never saw that connection. It seemed to me completely wrong. So I look at Iraqis, right, who were displaced by a war, which many people, including me, would say was an illegal war in their country that caused utter devastation. And they come to somewhere like the United States, which has been the home for people like that ever since its inception, and is lauded around the world for that, for being a place that you can come to, right, from places like that. But is there not a particular duty of care? Maybe you don't think there is, but is there not a duty of care to people who come from a war-torn place like Iraq, where the United States, along with the UK and other countries, waged that war in my view, completely wrongly, in a way that caused their displacement, caused them to lose their homes, maybe lose their loved ones, and they come here for a better life, but when they get here, they have nothing. Now, that may explain some of those numbers. I don't know. But certainly in that case, you've got to think, well, okay, if they're the ones who are getting the SNAP benefits, okay, what is the correlation between the ones who were displaced because of the actions of the United States and the UK and the other allies that fought the Iraq War on their presence here in the United States? And is there a duty of care towards them? I don't think we should lose in the mix of all this a compassion towards genuine asylum seekers, particularly from countries ravaged by wars which we may have been complicit in starting, in my opinion, on a false pretext.
Yeah, I think that I would sit there again. I would sit there and I would say, if we're looking at anybody that's coming in, if we caused some of this, let's see what we can do about it. Now, of course, somebody in America could say, well, you caused all of it, right? Okay, no problem. But if you're coming to America and you hate America, I have no tolerance for you. And by the way, the argument, some people in America are like, look, we don't want anybody else to come in here. This is plenty, right? There are people that I've had on the podcast that wouldn't even want me to be here right now. They're like, you know, you got lucky getting in here, which is their argument. They have the right to have that argument.
How wrong is that argument?
I will tell you, like, so if somebody's born in America and they're kind of like, look, man, yeah, maybe we got lucky with you, Pat, but we got a lot of ones that came through and we didn't get lucky with that. Hate America.
I would add the caveat of the Iraq caveat, which is if you go and bomb a country and you destroy people's lives, I do think a country like the United States, most prosperous country in the world, does have a duty of care to bring some of those people into its country, as it has done with the Iraqi community in the United States.
What if that's a royal screw-up on another administration that you never agreed with them? Because Trump doesn't agree with Bush. So maybe he's saying, I didn't do that. Bush did that. That wasn't my doing. I'm changing it.
It's genuinely one of those moments where you press play expecting the usual script, and then the opposite happens right in front of you. That's what made this Patrick Bet-David episode so jarring. Because if you've watched PBD for any length of time, you already know his favorite lane. He'll dress it up as just asking questions, but the destination is almost always the same. Muslims framed as a looming threat, immigration framed as a ticking bomb, Western ideology framed as something fragile that needs protecting from a specific group. And the twist is this. Piers Morgan, yes, Piers Morgan, ends up being the steady, grounded one in the room. Not because Piers suddenly became perfect, but because PBD's framing was so forced and so transparently fear-driven that even Piers couldn't just nod along. And that's saying something. From the second PBD pulled up those population charts, you could feel the trap being set. The graph isn't the point. The point is the panic he wants to extract from it. He's trying to steer the audience into, look how fast this is growing. Now imagine 10%, 20%, 30%. Are you scared yet? That's the whole strategy. Turn demographic change into a horror movie trailer, then act like you're being rational for feeling threatened. But instead of jumping on the paranoia train, Piers responded with something that actually resembles adult thinking. He acknowledged that countries can have real immigration and integration challenges, but he also made the obvious point that PBD keeps trying to skip. The overwhelming majority of Muslims in the UK live normal lives, participate in society, and aren't doing anything remotely like what PBD's framing implies. Piers basically brought nuance. PBD brought suspicion and vibes. And the part that always gets me is how PBD tries to sell Muslims as one single unified bloc. Like millions of people can be reduced to a single Islam way of thinking, as if they all downloaded the same operating system and are running identical code. That's not analysis. That's propaganda logic. Muslims have lived in the UK for generations. Many were born there. Many grew up fully British. Communities also grow naturally over time, through births, marriages, conversions, and migration, just like literally every other group. But PBD's narrative can't survive that reality, so he has to skip it. Then comes the Churchill angle, and this is where it got almost comedic. PBD tries to corner Piers with this fantasy where Winston Churchill is somehow the final authority on modern immigration. And not just immigration, but specifically Muslim immigration. You can feel what he wants Piers to say. Churchill would have shut the door on Muslims. He keeps pressing it like he's trying to squeeze a confession out of him. But Piers doesn't give him that. Piers basically says Churchill would have been tough on borders, sure, but he wouldn't have built policy around singling out one faith community like they're the unique poison in the water. That response quietly destroys the frame PBD is trying to build because it removes the Muslims are uniquely incompatible premise and replaces it with a broader point about capacity, services, and general immigration policy. And you can literally feel PBD getting irritated because he didn't come there for a broad conversation. He came there to get Piers to co-sign a very specific suspicion. And notice how often PBD tries to drag the talk back into Sharia, like it's an emergency siren. Anytime nuance enters the room, he reaches for that word because he knows it triggers people. Even when Piers talks about issues like unofficial religious tribunals or protests supporting banned terror groups, PBD doesn't treat it like a problem to understand and address. He treats it like confirmation of a larger story he already decided on. What's wild is that PBD is trying to run this entire storyline in front of someone who actually lives in the UK and understands the cultural reality on the ground. Piers isn't speaking from a meme. He's speaking from walking the streets, seeing communities, living the actual day-to-day. PBD is speaking like he saw a chart online, felt a vibe, and crowned himself an expert. Then we get to the Muslim Prime Minister question, and you could feel the discomfort spike the moment Piers said, "Yes, absolutely," without hesitation. Because PBD's whole worldview depends on the idea that Muslim political power is automatically a pipeline to extremism. So what does he do? The second Piers answers like a normal person. He instantly jumps to the nightmare scenario. Okay, but what if they impose Sharia? That move is doing so much manipulative work. First, it assumes a Muslim leader can just override the entire UK political system like it's a dictatorship. Second, it treats Muslim identity itself as suspicious, like being Muslim is a pre-crime indicator for theocracy. Third, it ignores how democratic systems actually function. The UK has parliament, courts, laws, institutions, checks and balances. But PBD wants the audience living in a cartoon where one Muslim politician equals instant Sharia takeover. That's not serious. And, to Piers' credit, he stays consistent. You cannot brand an entire faith group as potential extremists and call it fair. He points out what should be obvious. Extremism exists across communities, and it's dishonest to hold billions of Muslims responsible for a fringe. When Piers compares Muslim extremists to Christian extremists in the US, PBD can't even cope, because that comparison steals his ability to keep one group permanently in the unique threat box. You can hear the resistance in him. He doesn't want extremism is extremism. He wants their extremism is the real one. Then the refugee section takes the mask all the way off. PBD starts throwing out snap numbers like it's an indictment. Afghans, Somalis, Iraqis. Why invite more? That framing is brutal because it removes every ounce of context and tries to reduce war-displaced people to a budget line. And Piers does something PBD clearly wasn't prepared for. He brings responsibility and history into the conversation. He reminds him those countries didn't fall apart in a vacuum. There were wars. There were invasions. There were false pretexts. There were consequences. And when you help destabilize regions, whether directly or through complicit alliances, you don't get to pretend you have no moral connection to the displaced people who end up fleeing the rubble. And when Piers brings up Iraq specifically, it hits harder because he's not speaking like a detached commentator. He talks about opposing the war, about how the WMD claims collapsed, about how the war shattered lives, and about what it means when people lose everything and land in poverty in a new country. That's not softness. That's basic reality. And it completely breaks the cheap, they're on benefits, so they're a problem angle. What makes this section even more awkward for PBD is that he's also a refugee, which turns the whole thing into a mirror he doesn't want to look into. Because once you accept the logic that people coming from broken places are burdens, you start backing into a conversation where you have to explain why you're the exception and they are the problem. And that's exactly what happens. He tries sliding into this "some people wouldn't even want me here" line, and you can feel him attempting to justify himself while still refusing the same humanity to others. Then he hits that line about having no tolerance for people who come to America and resent America. And that's where it gets especially cold. Because if your home was bombed, your family was displaced, your country was torn apart, resentment isn't some shocking moral failure. It's a human reaction. The point isn't that resentment should guide policy. It's that PBD wants compassion to be conditional on gratitude, even when the suffering has a direct link to Western power and Western decisions. By the end of this exchange, the contrast is crystal clear. Piers is operating with lived experience, complexity, and at least a baseline sense of fairness. PBD is operating with fear, demographic panic, and a constant need to keep his audience emotionally activated. He doesn't sell understanding. He sells threat. He doesn't build arguments. He builds anxiety. And the funniest part is that none of this required Piers to be some heroic saint. All he had to do was let common sense show up for a few minutes, because when someone's worldview collapses the moment real context enters the room, that tells you everything. And that's the real takeaway for me. This wasn't Piers magically becoming a different person. This was PBD being exposed as someone whose entire pitch depends on people staying scared, staying reactive, and never slowing down long enough to ask whether the frame itself is dishonest. When you're just asking questions routine only ever points in one direction, you're not curious, you're campaigning. So no, maybe the problem isn't Muslims. Maybe the problem is the people who make a living convincing you to fear them.